All right, welcome back. Let's review where we are so far. All this week we've been taking a look at React and adding Redux to handle state manipulation, as opposed to having stateful components. We've been using stateless components all along. They're just plain old functions that are not responsible for maintaining their own state. Instead, they delegate this role to a centralized reducer, right? That is responsible for taking an initial state and then generating new states as the user interacts with the application. And then we connect our application, our containers, to the state coming from the reducers, and we also connect event handlers in the components that push dispatch functions and notify reducers of state changes, right? What the intents of the users are. So let's take a look at what we have so far. We have here as a demonstration of a piece of the assignment that is due later next week was to have kind of like a widget editor, right? That would allow you to add and remove and manipulate a list of widgets that each one containing different types of content, such as headings and lists and movies and links to other content. And so here we have a generic implementation where we can see here a hard-coded list of widgets of different types, type 1, 2, and 3. We can create new ones, new widget by clicking on Add Widget, and then we create a unique identifier. We display the title of what we just typed. We display also the type. We can remove it. We can remove existing widgets. We can change the type of the widget on the fly to type 2, type 3. So I'd like to continue looking at this. Let's see how we implemented that. We started off by declaring a centralized reducer. This reducer is the one responsible for providing and maintaining and manipulating the state of the application. We started with an initial state, which is basically just a plain old JSON object that has currently an array of widgets. These are the ones that were displayed when we first loaded the application. We came up with some generic types of widgets, WT1, 2, 3, some IDs that we made up, some titles we made up. And the reducer is just responsible for interpreting different actions that are being dispatched to the reducer. And depending on the type depending on the type of the action, we would either delete a widget, or create a new widget, or update a widget, and they all what they did is basically create a new state, right? We took the old state that contained the list of widgets, and we generated a new object, widgets, right? A new object that contained the same structure of the state, right? But based on the previous state, and manipulate it based on the action. In this case, delete widget was to we're going to filter only those widgets that were not the ID. We'll filter out the widget whose ID was the one we were removing, right? And so that's how we generated this particular state. Create a widget was again a brand new state with the same schema that contained an array that contained a brand new widget plus all the widgets that were there. That's how we create a new widget. Right? We just prepend maybe at the beginning or at the end or any particular update widget basically was iterating over the old widgets and just copying over or manipulating the old widget if it's the ID of the particular widget that we're updating. Right? In this case, it was just a widget type that we were modifying on the fly, but we could certainly just take the entire widget as a brand new version of the widget and just return that. All right, so let's take a look at how the reducer was introduced in our application. We loaded at the root of our application. We loaded the reducer. We created a store out of it somewhere down here. We created a store out of that reducer, and then we pumped that store we provided that store to the application. Right? The application is receiving this store. In this particular case, the only one who's caring about the store is our widget list containers. The only one who has any mappings, right, that is reading from this state and pumping it to the underlying components. So the container was the one who's connecting the states, the generated by the reducer, connecting it to an underlying component, right? The component that iterates over the widgets and renders them, connecting the state, extracting the state from the reducer, and mapping it to a property that we can then send over to the component, right? So reading from the state generated by the reducer and then mapping it to a property, and that property was then passed on to the component. The component received those widgets as a property, right, which we then use to just iterate over and render. Here we have the input field for creating new widgets, buttons to create a new widget, a drop down to select the type of the widget, and here's where the rendering happens. Right, we're iterating over the list of widgets, and as we iterate, we generate a brand new LI element. We're rendering the title, the ID, the type, and based on the type of the widget, we either render one type or another, or yet another. Okay, so that's a quick review on where we are so far. Any particular questions? Anywhere I lost you? Please let me know. We can take a look at it again. Right? Yes.
So there's kind of a lot of moving parts.
Yep.
I find myself getting lost in how all of those kind of coordinate. And I mean, you
Yep.
just gave a great explanation.
Yep.
But I take it in practice, everything will start seeming together.
Yeah, the idea is when we started with the hello world and the counter, right? I think those were trivial. Hopefully, they were trivial enough that if you do it once, following the video, the slides, once you do it a couple of times, then it starts. At least you'll know what you don't know, right? At first, you come at something and it just looks humongous, right? And once you do it a couple of times, they start becoming second nature, right? As they become part of your conscious awareness, right? So that it's not always new. Oh, it's the reducer. Oh yeah, there's a reducer. Oh yeah, this is a reducer again. Oh, there's always a reducer that's generating these things, right? And then once you practice it several times, you start saying, okay, the only thing that it does is just returns a new object. Okay, that's all it does, right? It looks at an action, and based on that action, it generates a brand new object. That's all it does, and somehow that has to be propagated to the component that gets rendered, right? Okay, well, that's the container and the mapping functions, right? So those are the moving parts, right? And there's a good diagram that we looked at early on that we can take a look at it again, that tried to abstract some of these flow of the information in Redux. In Redux, we took a look at the. I think it was is it in the trivial example? I forget if it's this one or the next one, the hello world. Yeah, I think it's this one. So the flow, right? That's the the view generates a dispatches, right? The view generates a dispatch, right? The dispatch notifies the reducer with an action object. That action object has a very simple schema, right? A structure. It only has to have at least the type property. That's the only property that's required, so that the reducer can know what happened. What did the component do? Okay, well, they clicked this button as opposed to that other button, right? Or they selected this dropdown versus they typed something at the. So the component sends a dispatch event, and the reducer then generates a new object that gets then added to the store. The store has the current state plus all the previous states, right? But we've only been playing around with the current state. That's the only state that we've been playing around with so far. Eventually, that store, the state, needs to be then mapped back to the component as properties. So the components have these properties as arguments, right? And the mapper is the one that says, okay, well, for that property that you're expecting, I'll extract it from the state. Right? So the state might be some very complex object of which the component might only care about a small subset, right? And so the mapping function, that's the responsibility, right? Grab these little pieces in the state and then feed it into the component as a property, right? So those are the moving parts, right? That you have a dispatch, you have reducers, you have a store that gets provided, right? And then you have the mapping functions. Here there's the state mapper, but we also talked about also a dispatch mapper, right? We said that a component could dispatch right from within the component, but typically that's considered bad practice. Instead, we add an additional mapper in between that says that we'll pass you a function, right? And then you call that function, and then we'll do the dispatching as opposed to you do the dispatching internally. We looked at both examples, right? We looked at both examples. So yeah, so I would suggest you do these very trivial examples. First, looking at it, follow slide by slide, then put it aside and maybe try to do it yourself on your own without looking, right? And then as you go, it says, oh, how I map this to that? Oh yeah, the mapper here and there. Okay. Yes.
Not to regurgitate what you said, but, so component is kind of what our user is looking at, and when a button is clicked, that gets sent to dispatcher to say, oh, hey, reducer, I want you to do this.
Yes.
And then reducer is the one who sends the JSON
Yes.
to our store.
Puts it in the store, yeah.
And our store is kind of like our internal database at the moment?
Yeah, the store, exactly. It's a storage. It's store for storage, yes.
And then state to properties is just saying, hey, these are our current properties. Let's start this back up again.
Right. So once the store is populated, a new component, a new state is generated into the store. Everybody who's listening, right, all the connect function, are going to be triggered, are going to be notified. Hey, the state's changed. Anybody care? Right. And so the mappers look at this. Oh yeah, well I care. I'm going to from this new state. Let me grab this piece of information and let's send it to the property to the property that I'm mapping it to, right, to the component again, right. So it goes from the please the so you have the store here, right? And the store when anything changes in the store, either by initializing and putting something in there, this is sent over to the container, which is connected, right? It's connected. So connected through the mappings. See, these are the mappings. These are the state to property mappers, right? That extract from the state, put it in the properties, and then send it over to the component for rendering. So the component is expecting, right, some property, right? This one goes from populates the property from the state. So it copies from the state and puts it in the property. Once it has a value for the property, it sends it over to the component as a property argument, right? Which then renders in the DOM. So the DOM gets rendered. Okay, the DOM gets rendered, and then if the user interacts with the DOM, right, by clicking a button, these buttons are being listened to by the component with functions, right? They're mapped to functions that are passed through here. Right? So this is an event function that gets passed also as a property, and typically we just call that event function that gets passed to us, right? That event was sent over also by this mapper, the dispatch to property mapper, right? So this one mapped this function event, right? Was mapped to a dispatch function, which is going to send a type of some action type. The dispatcher the dispatch is what triggers the reducer, right? The reducer that's going to look at that type, right? It's going to have type based on different types. Is going to return a new state object. Right, and that new state object is going to put in the store. Right, the store changed. It notifies all the containers. The container says, okay, well, I'm going to look at my mappers from that state. I'm going to grab a couple of the properties, and I'm going to pass it on to the component. The component sees new properties and re-updates the DOM. Okay, so it's a circle, right? As I generate events, those events generate a dispatch. The dispatch comes to the reducer. The reducer generates a new object, a new state, gets put in the store, and it notifies the rest of the chain, right? So all the containers. So the containers look at the state, grab what they need from the state, because the state might be fairly complex. They only grab the things that they need. They feed the property, and they pass it on to arguments in the component. And the component then re-renders the DOM, right? So the DOM is only ever re-rendered if the reducer generates a new state, right? What the reducers do is that they have the history of all the states. They look at the current state and they compare whatever the reducer is generating. If it's the same, if the states are the same, then nobody's notified. So they are identical. There's no need to notify anything. There's no need to render any DOM because the state hasn't changed, right? This circle only ever is triggered if the state is changed. Okay, right? That makes sense? Okay, all right. Should we take a picture of that? Well, that's what I was trying to do here. I'll re-update this slide. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah, you only ever have one store, but you can have multiple reducers, right? Yeah, you can have multiple reducers, and then you use combine reducers. There's a function just like create store. There's an additional function called combine reducers, and you can pass it as an argument a list of reducers, and it generates one master reducer. Okay, that generates the store. Okay, and we'll play with that.